3. The suffering of change. When faced with various types of suffering, human beings wish to remove or reduce them. While the suffering of suffering is temporarily removed or reduced, the Buddha referred to the change in feeling as the suffering of change. If this change in feeling stops, the suffering of change also disappears. Due to ignorance, sentient beings regard the suffering of change as happiness. When we are sick, the physical suffering of illness arises continuously and may even intensify without relief. At the same time, there may be various psychological sufferings such as inattention, fear of death, worry about work, concern for family, and distress over financial matters. When the condition improves, the physical pain of illness is removed or reduced, and the various psychological sufferings are also removed or reduced. Sentient beings crave this change in feeling, the suffering of change, and hope it will continue. However, in reality, this change in feeling cannot continue forever. Therefore, the suffering of change is fleeting. Desire will cause our hearts to burn. When desire intensifies through repetition, the suffering of not getting what one wants will grow. The yin and yang in the body will lose balance, leading to a suboptimal health status where both the body and mind are unwell. The suffering of not getting what one wants can give rise to the suffering of encountering what one dislikes. To temporarily remove or reduce these sufferings caused by greed, anger, and ignorance, driven by karma, we engage in many unwholesome actions such as killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, and lying. These negative actions give rise to the sufferings of birth, aging, illness, and death, and increase the suffering of not getting what one wants and the suffering of encountering what one dislikes. This creates a vicious cycle. From the above, we can see the relationship between the three types of suffering and afflictions. Let's explain it with some examples. Example 1. When we feel tired, the suffering of suffering, lying in bed makes us feel comfortable, the suffering of change. When we feel hot, the suffering of suffering, taking a cool shower makes us feel refreshed, the suffering of change. When we feel cold, the suffering of suffering, taking a hot bath makes us feel cozy, the suffering of change. Throughout our lives of craving for the suffering of change and disliking the suffering of suffering, we are nurturing the afflictions of greed, anger, and ignorance. These afflictions, in turn, increase our all-pervasive suffering, suffering of suffering, and suffering of change. Example 2. Hunger is the suffering of suffering. When we are extremely hungry, it is 100% hunger. When we start eating from a state of 100% hunger, the suffering of change we experience is the greatest. Then the suffering of hunger decreases from 100% to 90%, 80%, and 70%. When you reach a point of being only 40% hungry after eating, until you are about 60% full, the suffering of hunger becomes subtle. However, we still have an appetite and desire to continue eating. Ordinary beings mistakenly perceive this entire process of changing feelings as happiness, pronounced as kuai le in Chinese. Kuai means fleeting and le means alleviation. Hence, it is called kuai le, happiness. In reality, it is the alleviation or temporary removal of the suffering of hunger, which is the suffering of change. Example 3. A person who committed murder was initially sentenced to death. However, he received a sudden announcement that his sentence changed to life imprisonment. At that moment, his fear of death disappeared, and he experienced intense suffering of change. However, if a person who was originally free is falsely accused for no reason and ends up spending 3 days in jail, they would harbour strong anger and experience intense suffering of suffering. Both situations involve being imprisoned, but spending 3 days in jail is the suffering of suffering, while receiving a life sentence is the suffering of change, or what we call happiness. Why does the person feel happiness? Because their fear is alleviated. Therefore, happiness means alleviation. Example 4. When a smoker's craving for cigarettes arises, it is the suffering of suffering. The stronger the addiction, the greater the suffering of change. Similarly, the stronger the alcohol addiction, the greater the suffering of change. All the so-called happiness in the world has this nature. When we experience and realize that all worldly happiness is the suffering of change, we will no longer pursue or cling to it. Instead, we will seek liberation from the suffering of change, just as we seek liberation from the suffering of suffering. We must remember that worldly happiness is merely a temporary removal or alleviation of the suffering of suffering, which is the suffering of change. Perhaps you may ask, I'm in a good mood today, full of energy, without physical pain or mental afflictions. When a skilled masseur massages my back and neck, I feel comfortable and relaxed. I don't have the suffering of suffering, so how can there be the suffering of change? In reality, our muscles have experienced slight strain or fatigue, or there might be blockages in the meridians of our back. We are aging, but we are not sensitive enough. Only during massage can we feel it. If you were a healthy child and a skilled masseur massaged you, your back and neck would not feel any comfort, but rather pain. When massaging a healthy child, they certainly won't experience such comfort and relaxation. This illustrates that the suffering of change arises from the suffering of suffering. Of course, we have deeper and subtler suffering of suffering that cannot be alleviated by massage. We need to practice meditation. As we gradually enter deeper concentration, we will perceive it. When we reach the first meditative absorption of the form realm, we move from the desire realm to the form realm, suppressing all the desires in the desire realm. We temporarily subdue the craving for food and take the bliss of meditation as nourishment. From then on, if we eat any food, we will only experience the suffering of suffering, just like how a person who is already full feels when they continue to eat. If you have already eaten enough, but someone asks you to keep eating, you will feel the suffering of suffering rather than any suffering of change. Moreover, we temporarily tame the lust in the desire realm. Lust doesn't arise in us. There is neither suffering of suffering nor suffering of change. In the form realm, the energy channels of our body and mind undergo a qualitative change. The subtle suffering of suffering previously hidden in our body and mind in the desire realm is alleviated, and we dwell in the suffering of change. The first meditative absorption is called the stage of joy born of seclusion. The second meditative absorption is called the stage of joy born of concentration. And the third meditative absorption is called the stage of bliss beyond joy. All of them have the suffering of change. Since there is the suffering of change, there must be subtle suffering of suffering in our body and mind. When there are changes in the energy channels, we will feel them. The fourth meditative absorption is called the stage of equanimity and purity. At that point, there is neither suffering of suffering nor suffering of change, only all-pervasive suffering. This is what we refer to as neither suffering nor happiness. In ancient times, Taoist practitioners practiced alchemy. Those who sought to become immortals would cultivate inner alchemy, which means practicing concentration. They could unblock their energy channels through meditation. They also practiced outer alchemy, which refers to the use of drugs. They would consume small amounts of these drugs and then practice meditative concentration. The drugs acted as catalysts, aiding their meditation practice. However, if someone who doesn't practice meditation consumes these drugs, it can shorten their lifespan, similar to how drug addicts may die prematurely. Let's explain the case of drug addicts. When they take drugs, their nervous system is numbed by the drugs, and their body and mind are relaxed. They may experience hallucinations and even a sense of euphoria. However, once the effects of the drugs fade away, their nervous system will generate intense suffering of suffering. Their energy channels become blocked and constricted again. Then they will experience extreme pain. They need more drugs to unblock their energy channels, relax their body and mind, and alleviate the suffering of suffering. No matter what we do, as we continue doing it, it can turn into a hobby, which increases all-pervasive suffering. For example, fishing, playing sports, racing, playing mahjong, and gambling. In the hobby stage, we can control it. But if we continue indulging in it, it is no longer a hobby. It becomes an addiction and turns into the suffering of suffering. At this point, we cannot control ourselves. As our habits grow, we become more and more addicted and create a lot of karma. As a result, our body and mind experience intense suffering of suffering. The suffering of aging, illness, not getting what we want, separation from what we love, encountering what we dislike, and the suffering arising from the 5 aggregates will all intensify. Throughout our lives, we are constantly seeking to alleviate the suffering of suffering and craving for the suffering of change, creating a vicious cycle. This is our life. The three realms are like a prison. We are trapped inside, creating karma, experiencing karmic consequences, and going through birth, aging, illness, and death. The five aggregates are like a heavy burden. As long as we don't let go of this burden, we are devoid of peace. We carry this heavy burden of the five aggregates without interruption, continuously undergoing cycles of reincarnation. You cannot unload this burden because it dwells in our minds. Currently, we don't have the means to do so. Due to the constant grasping of the five aggregates, we remain trapped in the suffering of change, and all-pervasive suffering without liberation. The situation is the same for all sentient beings in the three realms. Now, let's summarize the different pursuits of sentient beings on different levels. Most people's pursuit is on the first level, seeking liberation from the suffering and yearning for happiness. When experiencing the three types of suffering, the sentient beings in the desire realm who don't believe in the law of causality and reincarnation increase their attachment, aversion, and ignorance. When experiencing the suffering, their anger grows. When experiencing the suffering of change, their desire grows. When experiencing neutral feelings, which are neither the suffering nor the suffering of change, they mistakenly perceive impermanence as permanence, etc., leading to the growth of ignorance. On the other hand, those who believe in the law of causality and reincarnation observe the 5 precepts, practice the 10 virtuous actions, and restrain their desires. As a result, they receive karmic rewards in the human and heavenly realms and temporary peace. We should be aware that peace is not happiness. Peace means having less desire and creating less negative karma, thereby experiencing less suffering of suffering. As a result, there will be less suffering of change, and we will live more peacefully. This is a state of life. Therefore, we should understand that peace is not the suffering of change, not happiness. The beings in the second level practice meditation and delight in the joy of meditation. As a result, they can attain positive karmic results, such as entering the first dhyana, second dhyana, or third dhyana in the form realm. However, even the beings in the third dhyana experience subtle suffering and suffering of change. Although they have temporary peace, they still have a subtle attachment to it. The beings in the third level dislike the suffering of change and don't delight in joys. Even in the third dhyana, there is the sublime joy beyond joy. Through meditation, they can enter the fourth dhyana in the form realm and the 4 heavens in the formless realm. They dwell in meditative absorption with peaceful 6 senses, temporarily free from the suffering and suffering of change. However, they remain in ignorance. The beings in the fourth dhyana in the form realm and the four heavens in the formless realm are trapped in all-pervasive suffering without being aware of it. They mistakenly believe that they have attained liberation. This is the situation of some non-Buddhist practitioners. They cannot realize it. They constantly dwell in all-pervasive suffering without any freedom. Driven by their karma, they pass through countless kalpas in the blink of an eye. When their throwing karma is exhausted, they suddenly emerge from their meditative absorption, like waking up from a dream, and fall into lower realms such as the third dhyana or the desire realm. The beings in the fourth level aspire to transcend samsara and the three realms. Those aware of all-pervasive suffering aspire to attain liberation from the three types of suffering and develop a genuine renunciation. They seek to transcend the three realms and practice the Dharma to be liberated from samsara and attain true peace. The peace mentioned previously is temporary. Those who cultivate renunciation must deeply contemplate, observe, and experience the three types of suffering of beings throughout the three realms. This is very important. It is the foundation for all those who practice the path to liberation. If you haven't thoroughly comprehended the three types of suffering, you should repeatedly listen to all contaminated things are suffering. Even if you understand it, you should continue to listen and listen again. Gradually, your renunciation will arise. Our practice is to transcend the three realms and attain true peace. Anyone who truly believes in the cycle of reincarnation and understands the three types of suffering will engage in spiritual practice. What are you pursuing? The suffering of change? Happiness is not worth pursuing. If you could see your past lives, understand the cycle of the six realms, and comprehend the nature of the three types of suffering, would you not engage in spiritual practice? Would anyone not practice the Dharma? Some people who haven't encountered the Dharma live in great suffering. They also seek liberation, but choose to end their lives by suicide. How pitiful! Although their physical bodies end, their minds haven't ceased. It is the mind that creates karma, and it is also the mind that experiences suffering. After suicide, the mind experiences even more suffering. The aggregates of feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness don't cease, so they experience even greater suffering. Such individuals often fall into hell and continue to undergo cycles of birth and death. The death of worldly beings, whether ascending or descending, is the beginning of the next cycle of reincarnation. As practitioners, we should contemplate the nature of the suffering and the suffering of change, thus eradicating greed and anger. Moreover, we should meditate that all neutral feelings are momentary and impermanent in nature, thus eliminating ignorance. By contemplating in this way, when experiencing the suffering of change, and all-pervasive suffering, we should seek to eliminate afflictions such as greed, anger, ignorance, doubt, and arrogance. We have concluded the explanation of the three types of suffering. Later, we can study how to eliminate greed, anger, and ignorance. We will cover this topic in our next lesson. Since we have realized that the three types of suffering are not worth pursuing, we should aspire to be free from them. The cause of the three types of suffering is afflictions such as greed, anger, ignorance, doubt, and arrogance. Therefore, next, we will learn how the Buddha taught to eliminate the cause of suffering. Here, we conclude our study on the three types of suffering.